Podcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another great webinar from CPA Academy. My name is Beryl, and I'll be your moderator for today's webinar, Diversity and Inclusion One-on-One. This week, we're going to be talking about team dynamics. I've got our presenters, Jina Etienne and Elizabeth Almer here, and I'm going to turn things over to them in just a minute. But before we get started, I'd like to go through some housekeeping items and do some quick technical checks to make sure everything is working on your end. First of all, if you don't mind going to the GoToWebinars questions tab on your control panel and letting me know you can hear my voice and see our title slide, you should be able to see myself and our presenters as well. Feel free to let me know what city you're listening in from today. I always love seeing where in the world everyone is tuning in from. And if anyone has any technical trouble during the webinar, please let me know in that questions panel. Please keep in mind there are quite a few of you here, and I'll do my best to get around to each of you as quickly as I can. This is also where you can put in your questions and comments today for our presenters. All right, let me check in on that questions panel, see where you all are from. Hello to Texas and Georgia, Florida, North Carolina, Virginia. That's where I am tuning in from today. Tennessee. All right. Now that I know that we're all set, let's go through some housekeeping. Today's webinar qualifies for 1 CPE credit. The way you earn that credit is fairly straightforward. Just stay logged in for 50 minutes of our session and answer the poll questions. We'll have a total number of 4 polls during today's webinar, and to earn full credit, you'll need to answer at least 3 of them. Now, if you're on a mobile device, you might need to click that answer a few times and scroll down to find your submit button. And if you have to log out and log back in for any reason at all, our system will keep track of your time. I wanted to let you know we are recording today's webinar, and the archive, along with your CPE credit, will be available in your CPA Academy account within 24 hours. We also do recommend that you download today's presentation materials, which you'll find in the Control Panel's Handouts tab. All right. Now that we're all set, that is all from me. It's time for me to step aside, and I'm going to turn the floor over to Jina. Jina, it's all yours.
Thank you. Thank you. It's funny, when everybody was responding with where they were from, I started making some notes. Somebody's from Merritt Island, Florida, which sounds fantastic. Avon Lake, Ohio. I don't know. Is that actually a lake? I don't know. I've never heard of it. Somebody's here from Canada. It's still cold there. And then the last thing is somebody's here from Salt Lake City. And I remember there's a really great restaurant there that served these amazing moles. If you know what that name of that restaurant is, throw it in the Q&A because I want to remember. I forgot. So we're just going right off on the sidebar at the beginning. But everyone, thank you so much for joining me and joining us, or not me, us. Today, joining me as my guest is Elizabeth Almer. She's professor of accounting at Portland State University in Oregon. She teaches intermediate accounting and auditing, which means it was you, Elizabeth, that we needed to get past in order to get our degrees. She's very passionate as an educator, and she believes in the transformative power of accounting to change people's lives. She called it the golden ticket. I'm going to ask you about that in a second. She comes from a very diverse background, which is really a great story. I hope she gets to weave it into today's discussion. And it's a large part of what drives her passion for D&I. And so, Elizabeth, welcome. And
thank you.
What's this golden ticket thing you were talking about?
So, it's kind of an old expression, the golden ticket, and it's something that I think really resonates with a lot of accountants. Students come through accounting and they, their first sophomore level accounting class, and so many of them say, oh, it's so boring. And, what we have to remember is that an accountant gets a seat at every table. You get a degree, and that degree is highly marketable. Good economy, bad economy, there always seems to be high demand. And what I have seen is that accounting gives you that opportunity to go where you want to go geographically. It allows you to work in industries that you might feel passionate about. And as long as you're willing to work hard, there is so much opportunity in accounting. And that's what I mean by the golden ticket. You don't see people who were accounting majors going off and say, working as a server in a restaurant after they have their degree. There's just so much opportunity. So I teach mostly first-gen students, and particularly for that population, that degree means everything.
Which indirectly relates to, what we're talking about today. And one of the things, and it's one of the things about the people that are joining us today, talk about diversity. They come from across the accounting industry. And I know I'm a second generation college. My father was first generation college, and the accounting degree really did change my life and set me off in a wonderful career that got me here. So, all right, so let's talk about what we're here to talk about, team dynamics. And, when you and I were brainstorming this session, team dynamics came up naturally because of some of your experiences navigating teams that maybe on their surface didn't originally seem to be as diverse as you thought. And then as you explored more and started to notice more, you really started to appreciate that diversity. So our topic, seeing and acknowledging difference, engaging different voices, understanding how to bring those voices into the conversation, into the work that you do, and then navigating the diversity. And then ultimately understanding how that diversity might be influencing the work that you're doing as a team, and the way you engage as a team. And so with that, before we get in trouble, I'm going to launch our first polling question.
Ooh,
I'm sorry,
yes,
Daryl, I completely forgot, and I'm really not trying to get fired.
this is a good one too.
No problem. We won't give you trouble yet. Let me go ahead and launch our first polling question. First question is, how diverse is your organization? Just to let everyone know, we do leave each polling question open for about 60 seconds so you can get your results in. You need to be logged in for 50 minutes of our session and answer 3 of the 4 questions to earn full credit.
I will be hosting, I think, late in April, one of these D&I one-on-ones to look at all of the questions that come through the Q&A that we don't get a chance to answer. I'm just going to host an open unanswered question type thing. So please drop your questions in and drop them in throughout. I'll pull them up as we have time and as makes sense. And then hopefully we'll be able to address them in this new feature, which is the open discussion piece.
All right, we'll leave this poll open for a few more seconds. Thank you so much to those of you that have already dropped those answers in. I'm going to close this one down in 3, 2, and 1. And Jina, would you like to see those results?
Yes, please.
All right, there you go. There is the split. It looks like 39% saying somewhat diverse, 37% saying very diverse, 20% not very diverse. I'll turn it back to you.
So Jina, I would say this is what my students would call a trick question.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason I think they would say it's a trick question is because it depends on how you define diversity.
Yes.
Can we flip to the slide where you have the concentric circles of diversity?
Yeah, the different dimensions of diversity. Sure.
Yeah, I like visuals. Yeah, this is a terrific slide that you suggested for today. And that idea of seeing and acknowledging differences, I think this is really the root of all of that. And I will answer the question that you had asked about, which was sort of my background. And let me just kind of quickly paint a picture of that. So I grew up in the San Jose area, which when I was growing up was already heavily Asian. And most of my friends growing up were Asian. And I loved it because my Asian friends were the only other kids I knew who were first generation Americans. My parents had fled Nazi Germany, and this was it was so great. I understood my Japanese American friend, my Vietnamese American friends, my Chinese American friends, because they understood that we all felt like outsiders.
Yes. I can relate to that actually, but this isn't about me, but I can relate.
Yeah, well, but that's a really powerful thing. And then I went to Santa Clara University as an undergrad, and I felt like an outsider again, because most of those kids didn't understand at that time. They were all, second, third generation Santa Clara, families, and they didn't understand that immigrant background. And so that was a huge piece of it. And I grew up going back and forth to Germany, visiting family and friends. And then I'm the youngest of 6 kids, and only 2 of us have married individuals who I would say identify as white. And when you look at the next generation of 12 grandkids, only 4 of those, again, identify as white. All the rest of them identify as biracial and various ethnicities. And so it's like every time, I really wonder sometimes how many of my siblings that was an attraction with their partners.
You know, it's interesting that you say that, and it actually gets us back to the topic because I'm biracial. Anybody who's attended this series knows I've mentioned that before. Well, so that means my brothers are biracial. Both of my brothers married women who are white. And when I look at my nephews, because they're only sons in the family, I'm not sure what happened. None of us get daughters, but something you said just now made me wonder. Oh, so sorry, everybody. Forgot to turn off the ringer. Something made me wonder, how do they identify? Because visually, if you looked at my nephews, you would assume they're white. And so when they show up at work, what is the mindset that they bring? How much of that mindset do we get to hear about? And how does it influence, if you will, back to how people show up? Would they feel comfortable talking about their background? You were very transparent now, but I mean, have you shared that for your whole career? And do you know if others in your team have shared that?
Absolutely not. It was something where I think I didn't really acknowledge that as being a really big piece of my identity. I think the fact that my parents were immigrants, because my dad really hammered us with that. My mom wanted to ignore it, but my dad really was really intense about it. But I think it really didn't become an outward part of my identity that I share with people probably until I was in my late 20s or early 30s. And, you know, I grew up in San Jose. I went to graduate school in Phoenix, which was the whitest city at that time that I'd ever lived in, and then moved and taught at the University of Miami for 4 years. And that is where I think I really began to, and I was right about 30 then, and that's when I really began to acknowledge how important these differences were. And I think here's really the key. I began to understand how little I knew about it.
Right. So
because I thought I was excited about moving from a very monolithic city in Phoenix at the time to somewhere that was much more multicultural. And then I was like, oh my gosh, I don't understand this at all. Because I came from a heavily Asian background.
You know, one of the reasons I love this series is you just get to have these conversations, these great conversations. And you got me thinking about, we all think we see those differences.
Yeah.
And more today, as we talk about and come to understand diversity, I think often the focus is on inclusion. But what we forget to do is look and just notice the diversity and try to understand. Well, first of all, put yourself in the other person's shoes. You know, just understanding your experience, Elizabeth, versus mine makes, I mean, there's so much to learn there. But then that might influence how I show up. So if I worked for you, or we were collaborating on a project, how might my identity fall on you? Do you even notice it? And then does it impact, and I'm not saying you specifically, but I'm thinking people who lead teams, people who collaborate in teams, does it impact then the way you talk with people, the kinds of things you expect them to say, something they say that you are then surprised by? I mean, has that been your experience as you've come to start to notice this diversity?
I absolutely think so. I think it's a little bit of a double-edged sword. And I will say, I think today, in some ways, I maybe have some more nervousness about whether what I'm doing is appropriate. Well, appropriate isn't quite the right word, but is sufficiently respectful. And here's what I mean by that. My experiences, for example, with my brother-in-law from one culture who came into my family when I was 17. I understand the way he interacts, and I understand what my sister will say sometimes about that's his culture. The way he's responding is his culture. And so now when I meet people from that same ethnic background, I tend to attribute a way of interacting with, in his particular background, a lot of it is about, can I pull one over the can I show the other person I'm smarter? And that's a sense of that everybody, when I talk to people in his background, say, yes, this is a part of our culture. So I think about how I interact with people from that culture, but is that fair? Am I just stereotyping them based upon what my brother-in-law said? But it does change my behavior from that one brother-in-law to a different brother-in-law's culture. And I'm just very intentionally just saying, a particular person's culture. His culture, the second brother-in-law, his culture is one where, if you study cultural differences, there tends to be much more of an unwillingness to ever say no, for example. So a yes doesn't mean yes. A yes means, well, I don't want to say no. So
yes means not no.
So I think it's tricky. And I want to say one other thing I think that's really important. I think that, my parents would have been, both of them, nearing 100 if they were still alive. And there's a lot of generational baggage, I think, with different cultures. And I have to take my hats off to my parents for always welcoming these people from different cultures into our family, because that is really, in the 70s and early 80s, that was not as acceptable. But yet they also tended to say, well, this culture tends to have these traits. And there would be a lot of discussion around that in my household. And I don't know how that translates now with people raising their children. How do we have those discussions in a respectful way to help become aware of the differences, but not use them in a negative stereotyping way? But this plays into the team dynamics.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so, I've been over here scribbling notes. I think most of us look at stereotypes as a single negative thing. And stereotypes, first of all, aren't by virtue of being a stereotype, bad or negative. And there's this wonderful TED Talk. I would encourage everyone to go look for it. I wish I had now put it in the slide deck. It's called The Danger of a Single Story. The woman is Chimamanda Adichie, so it's easier to write down the title. The Danger of a Single Story. And one of the things that she says, and this is not a direct quote, but she says, the thing about stereotypes is not that they are untrue, it's that they are incomplete, and that they paint us all as one thing. They emphasize how we are different and don't look at how we are the same. And so I think stereotyping, it gives us a context. The danger is, if you're thinking about your brother-in-law, how much of what you're talking about with him is personality, and the story he tells himself is its culture, but a lot of it is personality, family dynamics. He then brings that into the workplace. Somebody's applying a stereotype to him and thinks, well, the way he acts is the way everybody from that background acts, and here we all go sliding down the slippery slope. And I do want to bring this back specifically to team dynamics, because all of what you talked about, that might be the way you're going to treat somebody when you meet them at a conference or when you're introduced to a new student. But what about the colleagues you work with much more closely? Do you get past that stereotype to the point where you really do get to see them as an individual? And does it happen organically? Because when you're working with people, you've been working on your awareness. Your own awareness about your own cultural differences and inherent, in your family that you weren't necessarily living with on your sleeve, so to speak, as your identity. But so many of us are covering and hiding. And when we go to work, I'm trying to avoid the stereotype so that you don't tag me as that thing, to the extent it's negative. Okay, I've just rambled all over the place. But am I making any sense?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I love you. I'm going to have to watch this TED Talk. I think you're absolutely right. But here's where I think the trickiness comes in my experience with team dynamics, is that it's a tricky balance between utilizing what you feel about a culture or an ethnicity or an orientation that somebody identifies with, so that you can be more sensitive to it, yet putting them in a box.
Yeah.
And so my mother used to do this thing that when I was little, and you can imagine, dragging 4 kids to Europe on an old plane, a propeller plane. I still remember flying on a propeller plane. And, a lot of times sitting around, and my mother would love to watch people, and she would watch people go by, and she'd make up little stories to entertain us.
Okay.
That person looks like they come from such and such a country. What do you think they eat in that country? And trying to really appreciate that people are different and they bring all these different pieces together. but if you don't have a little bit of that understanding coming in, I think it's very difficult to really be as open and aware and sensitive. You've got to use it as a starting point, but then continue. And this has been my experience, and I try to use that as a starting point. Where do I have common ground? Where do I have an understanding? Give you a very specific example. This is probably 7 or 8 years ago, we hired a couple of new faculty in our college. They were not in my department, and they were both women of Chinese descent who came here to go to get their PhDs. And they both had moved from cities in the US where there was almost no Chinese population. And we had just opened up a 99 ranch market. Now, you know what a 99 ranch market is?
No.
It is the largest Chinese grocery chain in the US.
Say that again.
99 Ranch. It's the largest
Wow,
Chinese
I don't know it.
grocery
Okay.
chain in the US. Look up, you'll be stunned how many of them exist all over the country. Well, I happen to have known 99 Ranch from my time living in San Jose. That was actually my closest grocery store. And so as I'm getting to know these women and we're having lunch, one of the first things I said to them is, hey, did you know that we just opened up a 99 Ranch out in Beaverton? They were overjoyed. The fact that I knew something small about their culture built an immediate bridge with them.
So,
and
go ahead. No, go ahead. It reminds me of a question. Go ahead.
Well, and yet what's really interesting is, you can take stereotypes of, the stereotype of Asian women are very passive. Oh my goodness, these women are, in all the best ways, assertive, articulate, passionate about what they do, and they completely counter any of these old stereotypes of Asian women. But I learned that very quickly because I built a bridge first.
Yes. No, that totally makes sense. And the question I was thinking about, I don't want to get too far away from what you were saying. I want to go back to the 99 Ranch. Is that what it's called?
99 Ranch.
99 Ranch. So you bring it up, and it's a way to create a connection and acknowledge that it's a subtle but very clear way of saying, I see you, I understand and I know your culture because it's part of my awareness. Has that ever been, has that ever not happened? So you try something like that and it backfires, and then you're struggling to handle it. So hang on.
I will tell you, I did.
Yeah, I mean, we all have these moments where we wish we handled it differently, but specifically in the context of diversity.
Yeah, and I will tell you where I did. And it's been a while since I had a really bad one like that. Although I did one other bad experience I'll share later on. I don't think it fits quite with this. In moving to Miami, looking at Latin culture as very monolithic. I had grown up in San Jose predominantly, and I knew never to lump all Asian Americans together. I knew that one. And there was where I lived was a small Mexican American population. And I just thought, oh, I understand Latin culture.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. That was, and I had several instances of that, and I made people uncomfortable.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting. It's the same thing happens with Black, that people wonder, do I say Black or do I say African American? And as it turns out, just the term diaspora, well, Black people in this country come from many, 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 many different countries. First of all, Africa isn't a country. It's a continent with lots of countries within it. And then there's the Caribbean, and then there are people who identify as Black from Latin America. I mean, it's just, it's like any other culture. It's not monolithic. So I also want to go, what time is it? So actually, let's do the second polling question, because I want to ask you a question about something on your team specifically, where in your past experiences, you might have worked with people that you didn't realize were as diverse as you thought, or as not undiverse. What's the word for that? Anyway, I see the polling question is open. Let me be quiet.
You're all good, Jina. I did launch the second polling question. When it comes to noticing and navigating differences, how would you describe yourself? We'll leave this poll open for about 60 seconds. I did want to let everyone know there are a couple of comments coming in about an echo. I believe it was just a GoToWebinar blip. It's resolved on our end. But if you do notice that echo, refreshing your screen is usually the best way to troubleshoot.
Actually, I'm glad you said that because I heard some of that as well, and then it disappeared for me.
Yeah. If I notice it again, I'll unmute and we can try something on our end, but I think it might have just been a GoToWebinar technical thing. So I'll go ahead and close this poll down in 3, 2, and 1. And your results on the screen, 73% leading the answers. I noticed differences and I'm comfortable navigating them. Back over to you.
You know, I want to applaud those who answered, I noticed differences and am uncomfortable navigating them. I think that's very brave, and I appreciate that very much. It's too easy for us to want to say no, we get it, even that we don't get it, because we're afraid to ask the question. And I remember you sharing.
I am noticing that the poll question is still what is being screen shared. It may just be, if you can.
Want me to stop sharing, start sharing again?
If you can do that, that would be great, because I believe our attendees.
And start showing my screen. Did that work?
It did. Sometimes it just gets stuck. All right, go ahead.
Well, aren't we having technical fun today? I think, Elizabeth, if I remember, you shared so many stories with me, so I might have them sort of confused.
All good.
But I remember you talking about some colleagues you worked with where maybe one of them might have been either in an interracial marriage or they themselves might have been interracial, and you didn't realize it until they started making some comments and sharing some input on the team. How does that work when, back to the point of noticing diversity, are you surprised by it? I mean, how did you handle that?
Yeah, and I want to put a context with that. So I work with a lot of different kinds of teams, more so than folks would think for a professor. I think of my classes as a team, right? And my classes, and then I'll come back to answering your specific question.
Sure.
My classes, we are now a majority non-white university at Portland State, in the whitest state in the country. It's because we're the first gen school, and we have a growing populations, growing Mexican American, Asian American population here. So I deal with it there. I deal with it with my colleagues at Portland State University, but I also am a researcher. So I do a lot of research and have for over 20 years on gender issues in the accounting profession. And that's really my primary area of expertise. And it was actually when we first started chatting about this conversation, it was actually in the context of a research team that I have. And this research team is a complete joy to work with. And one person on the team I've known for going on 25 years, and the other 2 people were brand new to me. And one of the individuals I did not know, but her husband is from the Caribbean, and she has 3 biracial children. And I had no idea. And I, it's really funny, that it's like what your mom would say, if you can't say something to somebody's face, you shouldn't be saying it all. And I think the analogy is, if you can't say something to everybody not knowing what all their identities are, you shouldn't be saying it at all, right? Like does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm not so sure I agree with that, but yeah, it makes sense.
Well, what I meant was, anything that would have come out of my mouth should have been okay, no matter what her background was. That's kind of what I meant.
Well, but I mean, I don't want to go too far off the tangent, although these are dynamic and fluid conversations.
Yeah.
Some of the best ways we learn are when we stumble. We don't learn because we're perfect. We learn because we make mistakes. The difficulty, let me put this up here on the screen then, because this is one of the barriers that we have, is a lack of this psychological safety. That I'm afraid that if I can't say something that doesn't offend anyone in the room, I'm not going to say it at all. And as we become more aware of these differences, because we've talked so much about diversity and inclusion in the workforce. We hear it talked about in government. I mean, we're hearing about, when they announce the Oscars and the Emmys, we hear about it. People are almost pulling back.
Yeah, I think they are.
So I acknowledge what you say. I understand totally why you say it. I think there's absolute truth in what you're saying. I also think it's important for us to recognize that until we can talk about this stuff safely, until I can say, I don't think I understand you, then this is not going to work. And I would love to provide the very example of this dialogue we're having now is an example of psychological safety, because I trust with you that I could stumble. I could actually say the wrong thing or express that I have no idea what you're talking about, and you won't shame me, judge me, blame me, laugh at me, and that's psychological safety. So anyway,
right.
You were making a point.
So the point that I wanted to make was when she shared this, it became this moment of, I now want to know more so that I can understand the perspective that you bring to the table. But I'm so happy you threw up this psychological safety slide. I think this slide is incredible. I cannot tell you how this co-author of mine, who has now become a very good friend, has provided me into a window of experiences that I would never have had before. But this has been a relationship now that we work intensely together for periods of time that have been going, off episodically, we'll do this, and have been working together now for about 4 years. And probably not a week goes by that we don't text something back and forth to each other that is about these issues, about, her children are young, my children are, college age. How do we navigate these things? Did we read something great? But it has become a dialogue. It wasn't there in the beginning. And I think I want to circle back because if I'm grateful that the conversations we had as we were getting to know each other helped build that psychological safety. Yeah. Because that is so critical to being able to have those conversations. And I want to, one other thing that I want to think about. So my older daughter, she was born in Miami, and I don't speak more than a smattering of Spanish, and that's probably overstating it. And when I used to walk around with her in the grocery store in her little car seat in the grocery cart, all of a sudden these little ladies would come up and start speaking to me in Spanish, because my daughter has black hair.
So they assumed she was Latina.
They thought she was Latina. She still to this day does. And her name is a name, only because we loved it, that often is used in Latinx cultures. And so I remember her coming home from school one day being furious at one of her teachers. And her high school was predominantly white, with a good number of Asian American kids. And when anything came up around Latin culture, this teacher would look at my daughter. He made the same assumption. And so this is the other side to all of this that I really wanted to bring out, that I think is a conversation that I really struggle with. I value my co-author so deeply with the insight she has, because she sees two sides of things. She has children who are biracial, and she's white, and she helps me navigate a lot of things. But I also don't want to make her my point person for absolutely everything related to being Black in America.
No, I get it. And I appreciate that.
It's a tough one. I feel like all of these, you're dancing a little bit of trying to be careful, but also wanting to do the right thing and wanting to learn and understand and respect and make things work better.
And I would argue that there are white men listening that wish the same for them as well. Let's not
probably
your box. Now, I wanted to throw this slide up here, intersectionality. I love this graphic. There are a couple of them, but the reason I like this one is lots of pretty colors, but some of those dimensions of diversity show up here, where we're complicated mixes of people. None of us are any one thing. And even your background, your daughter is going to be highly influenced by you, your perspectives, your beliefs, your values, the way you live your life, just the way you talk and treat people. But she's also going to develop a perspective because of where she grew up. So you grew up on the West Coast. She was born on the East Coast. Geographic differences. In an area where there's a strong Latino culture or Hispanic culture, depending on what communities you are around. And so she's going to be bringing that to the table. Your colleague who's married, who's in an interracial marriage, who then has children that are biracial, she might have been, you didn't say this, but I'm just going to assume she was white. She might have been white, but her own identity would start to pick up some of the identity of her children because she's now a representative for those children. So none of this stuff is static. Even our own identities are fluid. You've even talked about awareness of and self-view around your own identity since the beginning. So I mean, I'm going to go back here. This is interesting because I keep looking at our title slide. Let me find this is the, I think I'm going to go to it here.
And I think some of this too goes to willingness to share some of these things.
Work where it's appropriate, but yes. Because there's a risk of oversharing right now in even the whole conversation of authenticity, which I need to cover in this series at some point. I don't think we completely understand what that means, but sharing the right thing at the right time, whatever you're comfortable with, and not because you have something to prove, but because it's relevant to whatever we're talking about or doing. Or I'm going to share something so that you understand where I'm coming from as part of my apology for stumbling and saying you're doing the wrong thing. By the way, I want everyone to know I do see the questions in here. I'm going to hold them. We will pull a couple of them out here in a bit. We have about 15 more minutes, 20 minutes or so. I can't. I'm a CPA. I don't do arithmetic. I know other CPAs are the same way. We do complex stuff, but 1 + 1. But so I wanted to put our discussion points up here because we haven't explicitly stated, we haven't gone through this like bullet by bullet, but we've been talking about all of these conversations. And I want to come back to the navigating team diversity piece, because with your colleague and with that research team, did it change the way your team engaged and shared? Did you notice that as people became more comfortable with each other and started to know more about each other, and I don't mean this as in we're chummy and friendly, but that the work itself was influenced by that?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And here's the reason why. And I should say that, where this team has even more diversity. If you look at it beyond just skin color, there are there are political differences, geographical differences, gender differences. It's been tremendous. And here's where I think this has really, really helped us. There is, when you are able to recognize, and I'm probably oversimplifying, so I want you to tell me where I maybe should be a little more complex in thinking about this. I feel like somehow you have to be able to start seeing those differences, because without seeing those differences, it's really, in a respectful way, it's hard to build that safety. But once you've got that safety, there's an ability to be critical of the work without having it be taken personally.
Say that again.
When there's the safety, there's an ability to be more critical of the work, to try to improve the work.
Oh, so you're talking about within the team as you're doing the work, and trying. And so in your case, the work, I don't know what a researcher does. But if you're pulling out a piece of data, you're analyzing it, and you're trying to interpret it to apply it to your research.
Yeah.
I'm so articulate right now. But that you can then criticize that work in a way that feels safe without feeling like you're criticizing the person. You're criticizing the process that you can get to a better product.
The thought process, the way things have been approached. Because if we're all sitting around walking on eggshells, we're not going to feel comfortable calling out when we say, gosh, I'm not sure you ran that statistical test right. I really think you need to do A instead of B. Or I don't really care for the way that paragraph is written, and here's why. But that all becomes so much easier to do when there's a sense of trust and safety. That, you know, there's a big difference between saying, I think we can get to a better work product together, than saying, you did this badly. And I think either one of those messages, the way any message of criticism is taken, is often a function of the trust that's in the relationship. It's somewhat in the way it's said as well, but there's a huge element of trust in that relationship that I, you know, somebody's, and by the way, within that group, we also have some power differentials in terms of experience, right? And that's another really big thing. And so it does, this trust thing, I think, is huge. And you can't, it's hard to build trust unless you can appreciate where people are coming from.
So you said trust, and I immediately went to the slide, and I'm so glad that these slides are here, because we weren't sure which of these we were going to use.
Yeah.
But this is a book, and apparently I have to make it, oh, there we go. I added all the rest of the content. This is a book, I highly recommend it, especially if somebody works in accounting. It was written from the context of an advisor in an advisory role to a customer or client. But this is a universal formula here where trust is made up of a number of different factors. Credibility is that I have the backing to say what I'm talking about. So in the context of race, if I'm speaking on about biracial issues, I have the credibility to talk about. Mm-hmm. Reliability is really about showing up on a consistent basis, but intimacy is that vulnerability. In intimacy, don't be distracted. This isn't so romantic. This is about being willing to be vulnerable, to share that I don't know, to ask an uncomfortable question, and to really challenge your teammate or your colleague, and be prepared to acknowledge that if you didn't say it right or didn't do it right, your intentions were, you had good intentions, but I acknowledge that I had an unintended impact. And all of this, the reason self-orientation is below that is because mathematically, those top numbers need to be high and the bottom number needs to be low. Because otherwise, if I'm selfish, it's going to undermine trust. And trust is at the core of us being able to move this forward. I see a comment in here. Karen made a comment about trust and understanding within the team grows the work product, and as the work product improves. And the data, Karen, I think I said that right. The data shows us that when people feel that they belong, and belonging in an organization is connected to feeling fostering inclusion, that the benefits make sense, that I'm treated fairly, that I have opportunities, therefore I'm trusting this organization. When people feel that, they are more engaged, they're more productive. They take fewer sick days. They're more likely to refer their colleagues to open positions in the organization. Overall engagement increases, productivity goes up. That all affects the bottom line. Simple statistic I found that I was shocked by is there's 170, they take 100, what is it, 170, no, sorry, 75% decrease in simply calling in sick. Can you imagine how much more productivity the employer gets when I show up for those 75 days? Those are real dollars. And so everything here affects everything. If only that weren't that, it's complicated. This stuff is nuanced. It's complicated.
It is. But here's the other thing too that I really wanted to be sure to be able to talk about in here, which is why I like the dimensions of diversity slide. Can you pop that one back up?
Sure. And then I want to do one more polling question before we jump to the Q&A. So let me just, which slide is this? Yeah, here we go.
You know, I made the comment that I'm at the most diverse university. It's majority non-white in the least diverse state, in the whitest state. I said it that way very carefully, in the whitest state in the country. And, you know, part of living here versus living in Miami or living in San Jose was understanding that when I walk into a classroom and I look at my students, I need to think about all of these different types of differences that are there. For example, Oregon is Portland specifically has one of the highest rates of transgender individuals in the country, and our university, I believe, at one point was listed as the top because there's a community here. And recognizing that there may be transgender students in the middle of their transition in my class, and how do I make them comfortable? And students who are white might be Eastern European immigrants. And I mean, I can go on and on and on. But this recognition that there's so many dimensions of this is really important, because I think when we look at a group and we see only, for example, I'll just use the most obvious, only skin color as our dimensions of diversity, we all of a sudden feel like it's more us and them, in the sense that it's just, there's one difference. But if you start looking at all of these differences, you realize we're all different.
Yeah, and then I'll come to this slide and how all of our differences intersect to create something very special and unique for each of us. You said something about make them comfortable. I want to come back to that. But before we do, I want to ask that question. We should have asked it before. So, Beryl, the third polling question about psychological safety.
Great. I was just going to chime in and say, can we launch that third poll? Let me go ahead and do that. Is there psychological safety in your organization? This is our third of 4 polls. We will have one more remaining before the conclusion of today's webinar.
So before, I'm just going to do a quick chatter here while the poll is open. You said make them comfortable, and I had a pop-up thought, which is the way to make people comfortable is to not say anything. It's people are just people. When you call out the difference, or when you try to say something to accommodate the difference, it almost projects your discomfort. And so one of the ways to make people comfortable is to make it a non-issue. We don't have to do something to make someone else comfortable. We have to acknowledge if we have made someone uncomfortable. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it does. And I want to go back to that example of my daughter being looked at every time anything came up about Latin, Hispanic, anything that she was looked at. And that's a way you make somebody uncomfortable.
Yeah.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and close down this polling question. The results are in. It looks like it's pretty split. 41% saying yes, 44% saying sometimes, 8% saying no. Back over to you.
All right, so 44 plus 8 is 52. That hurts my brain just to do that. But that means over half of our participants did not say yes. And so I think that there's some opportunity here to really visit that, because a large part of the overarching challenge for when we talk about team dynamics is whether or not there's an existence of psychological safety. And psychological safety is going to show up because I make it safe for you. And part of the way to make it safe for you is to call out bad behavior. When you see something, say something. If somebody asks a question and somebody makes a comment as if that's a dumb question, I'm like, no, all questions are fair. And actually, I appreciate you asking that question. So I just wanted to come back to that. If you have any other thoughts before we start to wrap up here around that polling question that says,
I do have one that's really important that has been on my mind a lot lately because of the pandemic, is the ability to build that psychological safety has been greatly damaged by all of our remote work. And in my experience, it's so much harder to build that trust when we're seeing people like this, as opposed to the little interactions of, wow, what is it you're heating up for lunch? That smells delicious. Sorry, it's always got to be about food, right?
Well, but the opposite of that happens if somebody's like, what is that smell? What is It can go both ways. And it's not a question of it smells delicious. It's clearly a judgment.
Yeah.
But
I think we've lost a lot of those small interactions that provide opportunities to get to know one another in less threatening situations. And I do wonder, and I hope there are some folks out there, some organizational management folks who are really going to help us try to understand how we build some of this in a virtual environment, because there's more. I think this is here to stay. I just am speaking from my own experience, largely with teaching classes online or remotely versus in a classroom. Right. Losing the walking back from a building across the street to the business building with students has been tremendous. It's resulted in a tremendous loss of connection. Yeah, and
go ahead.
No, that's good. Yeah, I want to be mindful of our time too.
Well, I was going to say, one of the things I've been reading a lot, I'm in a couple of articles because people are now talking about going back to work and that kind of thing, is, and I was on a big, I don't know, like 100-person meeting. Actually, it was yesterday. And somebody said, I'll be so glad when these meetings go back to being in person. And part of the reason they said that is in real meetings, quote unquote, real meetings. Hold on. I just had a notification pop up. Oops. One of the things we get to hear are the side conversations. We get to pull somebody and have a chat in the hall with somebody. These all happen in real time. I read an article in the Washington Post today. It was an opinion about coming back to the office. This was somebody who worked at the Washington Post and saying how you're hearing what some other people are thinking, even though they're not talking to you. And so there are all these moments of interaction that are gone. And the only interactions we have even today in the webinar are what you and I say back to each other. It's very difficult to have a dynamic conversation virtually because as soon as you want to talk, it seems like you're interrupting somebody when that dynamic happens naturally in person and it doesn't feel the same way.
Yeah, well, there is, I believe it's a Wall Street Journal article. It's a Wall Street Journal and New York Times that came out in the last couple of weeks. And it was actually arguing the opposite, that individuals who are, it was written from the perspective of a Black woman, and she was talking about how this has eliminated the uncomfortable situations to be, because it's not, oh, we're going, oh, dude, we're going golfing this weekend, and she wasn't invited, that kind of thing. But it is so, I don't know, it's a complicated issue, and I think it's just one that we need to be mindful of and watch.
Yeah. And thinking about today, looking at our very first bullet point, it's about seeing those differences. Now, to be fair, and Michelle wrote in here, diversity and inclusion also includes those who don't have kids and are single. And wow, have we not learned that? Thank you, Michelle, for reminding us all of that. Because so often when we talk about diversity and things like parenting, and we completely ignore people who are single because this country defers to couples. And in fact, we defer to cisgender couples. We're starting to see acceptance of same-sex couples, but that's still expanding. And one of the things we learned, speaking about the whole Zoom virtual experience, is that especially at the launch of the pandemic, people who are single and add to that living alone had, we as business colleagues, employers, leaders, and organizations didn't think to check on how they were doing because we only looked at the burdens being carried by parents with small children doing teleschooling, as opposed to the challenges of somebody in isolation. So thank you. I appreciate her. I don't know that's all that she wanted to bring up, but I appreciate that. We had a comment here from the very, very beginning, and the person who posted it is no longer here at the webinar, but she made a comment about our first question, how diverse is your organization? Then you said it was a trick question. She said, I am very diverse in a company of one. Diverse is an attitude. And I just wanted to acknowledge what she said and point us back to the intersectionality slide.
That's a great point.
Let me see in here. So this isn't a question, but I'm going to read it and then maybe you can share your thoughts. We have about, 3 more minutes or 4 more minutes here. Highlight difference between making it a non-issue and I don't see color.
I think that's huge. In fact, I had individual who's very involved with recruiting at one of the big 4 say to me that this individual, I'm going to be very careful here, in case there's folks who know me on the webinar, this individual said, I would like to make the question, are you colorblind, part of our interview process? And because when he asks about experience with diversity, oh, I just said he, asked about experience with diversity. He said people's responses sometimes when he's interviewing will say, I'm colorblind. And I think that ties into that comment that was made.
Yeah, so I did a session last summer with a colleague of mine named Barrett Young, and the title was I Don't See Color. It's available in the archive. I would encourage people curious about that to go listen. And he was very thoughtful about how he used it before, how he's come to understand it, what he thinks people mean by it, and acknowledging some of the challenges around that. Because the reality is we all see color. Mm-hmm. So what we're not saying, I don't physically see color. And one of the dangers in saying I don't see color is to mean your color doesn't matter to me. Mm-hmm. I don't see color also means that your ethnicity, your culture, your background, your perspectives don't matter to me, potentially. So I'll just throw that out there. So we have to do one more polling question. Before we do that, I'll just invite you if you have any final thoughts that you'd like to share with us, Elizabeth.
I think this is a conversation that has been a long time coming. I can remember being the only woman in the room many, many, many times. And it gives you, and my experience in Miami of often being the only white person in a room, gave me an appreciation of, as a white woman in America, okay, other than gender, I looked like I was in the dominant group. And everybody should know what it feels like at some point in their life to be a minority and to feel that you have been treated differently because of it. And I mean, differently in a negative way. And I would encourage people to think about situations in their lives where they are a minority and try to understand how it would feel if that was what your life was all the time.
Yeah.
Because I think that gives you a great appreciation for how to start down this journey.
That is so true. It's not just walk a mile in someone else's shoes. Live that experience.
Live it. And everybody, if they look for it in the broad scope of diversity, you can find somewhere where you are the other.
Yeah. We actually had my guest 2 weeks ago. The title was called Lived Experience. And so with that, I just want to remind everybody, this is a bi-weekly webinar series. In 2 weeks, I'm going to be talking with Maggie Wall. She's at Citizens Bank. She and I met last summer. Preparing for a conference session, and she does work around empowering, understanding, and building wealth, and the importance of building wealth in fostering sort of safety and inclusion culturally. And she focuses on women, and then from there pivots out to a lot of other groups. And so I just want to invite everybody to come back and to join us. The registration page isn't open yet, but it will be soon. We'll go ahead and launch that last polling question, Beryl, and close out the webinar.
Great. Let me go ahead and launch that poll. And this poll is simply, what was the most valuable part of today's webinar? We'll leave this polling question open for about 60 seconds, but while this poll is open, I'll share a couple of final reminders. We here at CPA Academy will process your credit later today. That, along with a copy of this webinar and your handouts, will be available in your CPA Academy accounts within 24 hours. If you look in your email inbox, you will also find the evaluation link for this session. We always appreciate hearing your feedback on our webinars. All right, thanks so much for getting those votes in. We'll leave this poll open for a few more seconds.
I always appreciate the honesty of the best value today was the CPE, because you know what? I come for the CPE and I hope you had a moment of, that sounded a little interesting. We can only hope.
I love the comment that just came in, Jina. The best part of this webinar is that it's the starting point for some much needed self-reflection.
Thank you. That's wonderful.
Yeah. I'm going to go ahead and close this poll down. And I want to thank both of you, Jina and Elizabeth, for being here with us today. Is there anything else you would like to share before we close out for today?
No, I appreciate everyone joining and sharing their thoughts through the Q&A, and I hope to see you in a couple weeks, 2 weeks.
Super.
Yeah.
In the meantime, please check the schedule on our website for additional information, and we hope to see you on a future webinar. Have a great day, everyone.